Before I begin, why don't you turn to the person beside you and just say to the person, Blessed Christmas. Would you do that? Blessed Christmas. Blessed Christmas. Christmas, for many of us, is meant to feel, joyful, peaceful, happy, lots of food. I don't know about you, but I think I've already gained about a kilo of eating this week, and I'm going to eat some more later on. It's supposed to be safe, right? It's supposed to be nice. Soft lights, like now, familiar carols, which we just sang, warm gatherings of family and friends. It's a season that promises comfort and calm. But if we are honest, for many people, especially in areas that are war-torn right now, Christmas doesn't feel safe at all. For some, it can be the most anxious time of the year. I'm not referring to the turkey that hasn't been defrosted in my fridge that I'm supposed to bake for my family tomorrow. I'm not referring to those kind of anxiety. But for people who are lonely, for people who don't have friends to celebrate with, it can be the most anxious time. In fact, researchers, the statistics tell us the suicide rates during these festive occasions is at the all-time high. And for others, it exposes loneliness rather than just joy. And for many around the world today, especially in 2025, it arrives in the middle of war, it arrives in the middle of instability, of fear, and even uncertainty. Just a few days ago, I'm very sure none of you have heard of this name called Sharif Osman Hadi. How many of you heard of his name or know who he is? None here. Sharif Osman Hadi. He is a 32-year-old student leader, in fact, of the 2024, we haven't reached 2026, uprising in Bangladesh. And he was assassinated just last week. A young man who stood up for justice, a voice for reform, silenced by violence. And he did not die in a battlefield. He died in a hospital bed while receiving treatment, of all places, here in SGH, Singapore. And almost as if though God is trying to tell me, because I prepared a sermon on Luke chapter 2, verses 8 to 21. But as the things unravel throughout the week, I realized that, I need to change the message. Because the message is not just simply about joyfulness, about welcoming the birth of Jesus. It's a message that should bring genuine hope in a very troubled world. And in rapid succession itself, we hear of what? The violence, say for example, in Taipei, the mass shooting in Bondi Beach, and even a fake terrorist threat here in Singapore at St. Joseph Church in Bukit Timah. Suddenly, I don't know about you, but suddenly the language of Christmas seems very fragile. No more peace, no more joy, dangerous. So what kind of hope survives in a world like this? What good is hope when power kills truth? What faith actually holds up when evil seems to win? And these are the questions that Matthew forces you and I to confront this Christmas day. This morning, we come to a Christmas passage that I almost rarely hear preachers preach from. It never appears in especially greeting cards. I hope nobody sends you a greeting card about the murder of children, right? And it's taken from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 21. It's a passage that's filled not with angels singing, but with threats, with deception, with escape and flight, and of course, grief. And yet, this is still a Christmas story, because Matthew wants us to see something far deeper. He wants us to see that Christmas is not God arriving after the world becomes safe. Christmas is God entering the world as it is. And what is this world? This world is dark. This world is devious, is dangerous, and yes, even death. Which brings us to the question that all of us must answer today, and it will guide us throughout this message. And that is, what kind of hope does Christianity really offer in a world like this? As we are going through this series on hope and Christmas, I hope that you really meditated and think through very carefully what hope truly means biblically. And this is the question that we have to answer honestly if we want to celebrate Christmas. Is Christian hope strong enough to face real evil, real suffering, real loss? When the world feels unsafe and unjust, what makes Christian hope so different from other religion, or perhaps even wishful thinking? These are not questions for theologians or pastors like myself. They are questions for, say, for example, parents who worry for their children and their future. Young adults disillusioned by politics and power. People carrying grief, perhaps you have lost someone dear this year, that never makes it into perhaps the social media. You don't post it. Anyone who wants to know whether Christian hope is credible. Perhaps you're a seeker. You've been hearing or you've been attending church, but you have not made any commitments at all. And Matthew answers these questions, not sugar-coating reality, but with a story, a shocking story, in fact. And before we come to today's text, let me remind us of the journey over the last 4 Sundays, what we have actually covered this Advent season. Starting from the end of November, I preached on Micah chapter 5. If you recall, Micah chapter 5, it talks about a prophet Micah, who spoke into national collapse, corrupt leaders, crumbling security, crushing Assyria at the gates itself of Jerusalem. And Micah reminds us, God's greatest hope often begins in the smallest places like Bethlehem. Then, of course, in Ruth chapter 1, Pastor Kenny reminded us that there's a woman who lost everything, Naomi, her husband, son, her future, and walked back to Bethlehem. And she was completely empty, and she, in fact, wanted to be called Mara, which means bitter. And yet, hope quietly follows her home through her daughter-in-law. And in Luke chapter 1, Dr. Benita Lim gave us Mary's song, a young, powerless woman praising a God who lifts up the lowly and fills the hungry with good things. Then last week we have Dr. Quack, who came and he preached from Matthew chapter 1. Of all passages, he chose the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And we trace that genealogy filled with broken people, scandals, outsiders, and certainly failure, right? And of course, we learn that God rewrites redemption through very messy and insignificant lives. So as we begin in Matthew's passage today, not with celebration, but with tension, we start with a king who pretends to worship, but plans to destroy and to murder. And there, in the face of rising evil, we see our first answer to the question, what kind of hope does Christianity really offer. And the very first thing I want us to know is that this hope threatens. This is the summary of the last 4 weeks. This hope threatens false powers. Let me read for you verses 8 selectively to verse 12. And it says here, and he, referring to Herod, sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Verse 9, after listening to the king, the three men went on their way. And verse 11 says, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Verse 12, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Matthew begins the Christmas story not with peace, but with politics. King Herod hears a child being born. Not just any ordinary child. This child is called the King of the Jews. In verse 2. And Matthew tells us plainly that he was deeply troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Everyone was troubled. But we already have a king called King Herod Antipas. Why is there another king? You see, before you think that Herod was just confused, or perhaps he was curious, actually Herod was cornered and he felt threatened. If you think about it very carefully, when we get upset, when we get murderous, when we get angry, what are the times that trigger us to be so? If you think about it very, very carefully, those are the times when our power, our position are being threatened, right? Yeah. And when things don't fall according to our plans, that's when we feel that we are being threatened, we are being cornered. Herod Antipas represents everything that looks powerful in the world in Jesus' days, but it's actually hollow in the core itself. Authority without righteousness, control without truth, power sustained by fear. And history confirms what Scripture already tells us. If you go and read up any historical books, Herod Antipas ruled ruthlessly. In fact, he killed his wife to marry Herodias. And who's Herodias? His brother's wife. He executes his own son because he felt that they were a threat to his position. He crushed dissent without any mercy. That was Herod. And when the Magi came to tell him that there's a new king, Herod responds with what? False power. The way that false power always responds. He pretends to worship, but plans to destroy. And here Matthew shows us the very first answer to our question. What kind of hope does Christianity really offer? It's a hope that threatens false power and exposes them. Hope doesn't challenge Herod with fist fights. Hope doesn't unsettle him by the word becoming flesh. Not within human violence, but with God's humble incarnation. This is why hope is always dangerous to especially unjust systems. This is why we see in the world today powers that try to silence people who speak of justice. And when truth is spoken, power feels exposed, naked. When justice rises, oppression pushes back. Sharif Osman Hadi did not carry weapons, mind you. It was always a peaceful protest. He carried ideas, not weapons. Or if you think about it, in Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, what did she carry? Not weapons. Or if you think about science, do you know Galileo Galilei, the Italian astronomer, who was persecuted by the Catholic Church for supporting heliocentrism, which is that is the earth goes around the sun. And in those days, he said, no, the sun goes around the earth. We are the center of the universe. The earth is flat. And yet, that was enough to threaten a system built on fear and power. And Matthew teaches us something very, very vital here. Unstoppable hope does not need to overthrow power. It just needs to outlast it. Let me say that one more time. Unstoppable hope does not need to overthrow power. It outlasts it. God protects this hope quietly, silently. The Magi are warned in a dream and they return home in another way. No confrontation, no spectacles, no show, no spotlights or anything like that. Just divine guidance and protection. And once again, we see the same pattern throughout this Advent series that we are talking about. Ruth returns quietly, Mary sings quietly, and Jesus enters history quietly. Hope threatens false powers. Unstoppable hope does not announce itself loudly, but it cannot be erased at all. The birth of Jesus cannot be erased. But this threatening of false powers is just the beginning. If hope truly enters the world, what happens when it collides with suffering and displacement? What happens if this hope actually meets reality? And Matthew answers that very question itself. What kind of hope does Christianity offer in the very next few verses, in verses 13 to 15? And we get this idea that this hope enters suffering, not explaining it away. Verse 13 says, Now, when they had departed, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he, Joseph, arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Now the story turns darker. Joseph is warned, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Now if you think about it, Egypt, a single place, a single geographic location, a single word, but it carries with it centuries of pain and humiliation, especially for Joseph and Mary. They're Jews. Why? Because this is a place of slavery, a land of tears, memories of bondage, because their ancestors, their forefathers, Joseph and the brothers, they were all there. And Jesus was there, not for refuge, not for safety, but exile. Which is why Matthew quotes Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. He says, Out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew wants us to see something very unmistakable. He wants us to see that Jesus begins his life not as a protected prince, but as a displaced child. Imagine this, the moment you're born, you have to leave your country. And this answers that question, what kind of hope? What kind of hope does Christianity really offer? A hope that enters suffering instead of explaining it away. Jesus experienced the same kind of trauma, suffering, anxiety, loss of hope even, together with his parents when they flee to Egypt. Christian hope does not promise that you will avoid the valleys, the shadow of death. It promises that God will walk with you and through it with you. That is what Christian hope means. When Jesus is born into this world, he doesn't say that, oh, you're going to enjoy life, turkey every day, pop your champagne. Life is like a walk in the park. Jesus is saying that these messy things will happen, and God, through Jesus Christ, will walk through it with you. And this matters very, very deeply, because many of us assume what? If God is with us, life should get easier, right? Health, wealth, prosperity, right? Name it, claim it. Now Matthew says, if God is with you, Emmanuel, he may lead you through the abyss, but never alone. That's the assurance. See, as a pastor, I sat with people through some of the hardest moments of their lives. In fact, the aftermath of a messy breakup, betrayals, and even bad news that breaks. Or during the late night, suddenly I get a call. And usually it begins, Pastor, I don't know who else to call. I actually live with a bit of anxiety and fear whenever my phone rings after 10 o'clock. Yeah, seriously. Yeah, when it rings, I say, oh dear, is this something terrible? Perhaps at deathbeds where time is painfully very short. And of course, during funerals when your time runs out, words no longer comfort. And over the years, I've noticed something, that people who eventually find their footing and become stronger again are not the ones who suffer less. They don't need you to tell them what to do. They don't need you to just tell them, you should do this, this and that, try this and that. I visited our elder Akong yesterday, and I do instinctively the same thing. Oh, you should eat this, you should do that, you should rest this, have you tried? Because why? We want to appear to be in control, right? But actually, these situations don't require us to tell them what to do. They require us to be with them in that moment. These people who eventually find their footing are not those who suffer any lesser. These are the people who have hope. Not because their pain has disappeared, not because their questions were all answered properly, but because somehow, in the middle of the valleys, in the shadow of death, they discovered that they were not alone. They could say, my God is with me. Jesus is with me. That, my dear friends, is the difference. This is what hope brings for us this Christmas. God is with me. Hope in real life is not the absence of suffering. It's the presence of God in the suffering. Jesus did not spare his own family from fear. He shares it with his parents, his earthly parents. He does not bypass all the hardship. He sanctifies it. And this is the hope that Ruth experienced. Naomi thought Bethlehem was the end. This was a hope that gives them the idea that God is writing a new beginning for them. This is the hope that Mary sings about.